Bonjour, mes amis. What is going on, everyone? This is Eric coming at you live from just outside Hartford, Connecticut. Um, yeah, you heard me speak a little French. Why not? You'll hear a little bit of French here and there. And I do apologize if you got a problem with that. If you don't understand French, I took French in high school, and this will be the first time I'm practically using French in real life. As you can see today, I'm wearing my Philadelphia Flyers shirt, and I got my proud American flag pin. You'll be seeing it every time I'm doing a recording within the next week, just because we have the 4th of July coming up. So this will be fun. So today we're doing the history of the Montreal Canadiens. I do apologize. Video was ideally going to go up yesterday, but I had a couple things come up and out of nowhere, and I wanted to finish the script for the video that's going to come up tomorrow. So Patrick and I just kind of switched days. No problem with that. But without further ado, we're going to jump into the history of Les Montreal Canadiens. Like I said, if I mispronounce any names, as you guys know, I do apologize for that. But anyway, we're going to jump into the video now. So, of course, the Canadiens were founded in November of 1909 when an industrialist named Ambrose O'Brien met a player manager of the Montreal Wanderers, a former team, named Jimmy Gardner. So O'Brien had gone to Montreal in an attempt to get his hockey team, the Renfrew Creamery Kings, yeah, don't ask, into the Eastern Canada Hockey Association. So they denied him, and then they just disbanded out of the blue. So the league was gone, and they formed the Canadian Hockey Association, and they kicked out the Wanderers. So basically, at this point, O'Brien and Gardner both don't have a league for their teams. And so the two of them start discussing, and they form a new hockey league. And this league would consist of the Wanderers, the Renfrew team, and two other teams O'Brien owned. And with that, the National Hockey Association, or NHA, was formed on December 2nd, 1909. 2 days later, the Montreal Canadiens were formed. At this point, though, they were just known as Les Canadiens, which of course means the Canadians in English. So Gardner had suggested that O'Brien would start a team of francophone players in Montreal. Now, francophone is basically someone who speaks French. Um, at this time, the French Canadian players were few and far between in the NHL, as they were seen as lesser than Anglophone or English speaking players and teams. And the teams were just worse because players who were good at hockey and spoke French didn't really succeed. They didn't care, so they didn't try as much. And the goal, basically, after they formed the team, was to sell Les Canadiens to a francophone sportsman once the team in the league took off. That way, they actually had somebody there who could relate to the populace. So then we get to 1910s. So in the early days of the NHA, players were constantly on the move. So like someone would spend 3 games on your team and then he'd go join a rival league for 2 seasons, come back to you for 5 years, jump back overseas, go to another place for 3 years, come back to you for 3 games, and then go back to another team. It was just a mess. So I just wanted to get that little disclaimer out for early on hockey. So what they did is their first games they would play at the Jubilee Arena, and the Canadiens' first de facto GM was Jack Laviolette, and he was a player in the ECHA, but he had jumped over to the NHA, and basically his goal was to help convince like francophone players to come to the NHA and the Canadiens in particular. So the team would sign 3 cornerstone players right out the bat, and they were center Newsy Lalone, um, right wing Didier Pietre, and center Skinner Poulin. And they were the stars of the team, like I said. So the Canadiens had a tougher season. They went 2-10. Now, again, 2-10 in your first season isn't horrible. It's not great, but it's not horrible. The league's just starting. The team's just starting. So the following season, George Kennedy would purchase the Canadiens, and he would officially name them the Montreal Canadiens. Now, Kennedy had this whole lawsuit going on over the team name of Canadiens, and rather than fight him in court and everything like that, O'Brien just kind of sold the team to him. He's like, okay, I'm not dealing with this garbage. It's not worth it. So at this point, they're the Montreal Canadiens, and they would sign goaltender George Vezina before the 1910-1911 season, and the team would improve that season. After the 1910-11 season, Skinner Poulin would lead the team. They would move to the Montreal Arena before the 1911-12 season, and again, right wing Didier Pietre would leave the team to play in Vancouver in time for the 1913-14 seasons. So, a lot of player movement, like I said early on. They would make the playoffs for the first time in the 13-14 season, but they lost to the Toronto team. So Didier Pietri would return to the team after one season off, playing overseas, playing in Vancouver. So the 14-15 season would conclude with a new format, which put the NHA's winner against the Pacific Coast slash Western Canadian slash Western Hockey League champions. So basically, the NHA was considered the superior of the three, or they had the most money backing them, or however it was. So, or of the four, sorry. So they would play the winner of those three leagues. So basically, the winner of the NHA would face off against the best team from the three leagues. So the teams from those three leagues would play each other to decide who the best was of them all. So the Canadiens did not qualify for the playoffs in that first season, though. You know, again, they're still Vesna is by far their best player at this point, and it's not even close. So the 15-16 Canadiens would win the NHA and would compete for the Stanley Cup for the first time in their existence. And they would play the Portland Rosebuds in the Stanley Cup. Yeah, some of these names are really weird. And they would beat the Rosebuds in a best of five series, 3-2. So in March of 1916, the Canadiens would get their iconic CH logo, which is what the picture in the thumbnail is. So in 1917, they would make the Stanley Cup Finals, but they lost to the Seattle Metropolitans. So, at this point, the Canadiens are a good team, but they're not the best. They're still very good, though. So here we are. In November of 1917, the NHA becomes the NHL. So the Canadiens are considered one of the charter members of the franchise, of the league. And in early January of 1918, the Montreal Arena burns down. So the Canadiens would move back to the Jubilee Arena. And during this time, it's a bit of a rough patch for the Canadiens. Their GM, who was also playing for the team, Jack Laviolette, would lose his foot in an automobile accident. And this effectively ends his playing career. Obviously, he can't play with just one foot in, in hockey, especially 100 years ago. So the team's good in 1919, and they would make the Stanley Cup against the Seattle Metropolitans again. However, the Spanish flu would strike, and multiple players from both teams became ill, with far more cases occurring on the Canadian side. So the Canadiens owner, George Kennedy, he announced that the team was going to forfeit the Stanley Cup, but the Seattle Metropolitans owner said, no, we're not going to accept that. This isn't the fault of your own. We're not going to do that. So they claimed it wouldn't be sportsmanlike to claim a title due to, the Spanish flu. So basically, the Stanley Cup, it was a few games had been played, but they just said, you know what, we're just not going to have a Stanley Cup this year. No one wins it, no one loses it. So the 1919 Stanley Cup was not awarded. Now, defenseman Joe Hall of the Canadiens would actually die from the Spanish flu, from complications from the Spanish flu. So it wasn't a joke. Like, these guys were seriously ill. Also, the Canadiens owner, George Kennedy, caught the Spanish flu, and he ended up suffering from it. And it didn't kill him right away, but we'll get, it didn't kill him immediately, but it did affect him for life. So in the summer of 1919, Jubilee Arena burns down. So now, within the past year, the Canadiens have lost two stadiums, had the Spanish flu kill one of their players, and, their GM player manager lost his foot in an accident. Not a good year for the team. So the team would open the Mount Royal Arena in early January of 1920, and it was rushed and incomplete. So the arena had a natural ice surface, which meant there were plenty of imperfections, and people didn't like that. So in the 1910s, the Canadiens made three Stanley Cups. One of them was canceled, of course, the 1819 Stanley Cup. And they won one of the two that actually was awarded, which was the 1916-1917 season. I mentioned before how I break up the decades in the history of the Bruins video. So if you have any questions, watch that video again or watch the beginning of it. You'll understand it. So now we get to the 1920s. So in 1921, owner George Kennedy would die. Now he had complications, like I said, from the Spanish flu, and it eventually caught up to him. It was too much. So after the 21-22 season, the team would trade center Newsy Lalone to the Western Canadian Hockey League's Saskatoon Crescents for a prospect named Ariel Juliet. Now, interestingly enough, the Canadians didn't want the prospect Juliet. Um, they wanted money, but the NHL made them take a player. They said you can't sell a player to another team. You can't sell a player to another league. You need to take a player. So Juliet would make his debut for the Canadiens in the 1922-1923 season. So after that season, the team would the team would lose right wing Didier Pietre as he retired for the last time he would leave the Canadiens. So they would sign amateur center Howie Morenz before the 23-24 season, and he would make his debut that year. Now the Canadians went on to win the 23-24 Stanley Cup over the Western Canadian Hockey League's Calgary Tigers. On December 8th, 1924, the Canadians would play their first game against the Boston Bruins. And this would spark a rivalry that is still going on to date. And the Canadians would win said game 4-3. So the Canadians would win the NHL after the Hamilton Tigers refused to play them without receiving a $200 bonus. So basically, um, the 24-25 season saw the Canadians as the NHL champs, but you normally had to do a playoff against the one team would play the two team. But the Hamilton Tigers did not want to play. So they said, okay, you know what? We want $200. We're playing in the playoffs. We want more money than you're giving us. And ownership refused to pay them $200 a piece. So they just said, okay, we're not taking the field. So that gave the Canadians the NHL title. Now they still had to play the Stanley Cup, and they played against the Western Canadian Hockey League's Victoria Cougars, but they lost to the Cougars. So yeah. Um, so November 28th, 1925 was opening day for the Canadians and for the 1925-26 season. And after the first period of the game, their goaltender George Vesna, he began to vomit blood. So what had happened is he had lost 35 pounds 6 weeks, and on game day he had a fever of 102 degrees. So there were red flags immediately, but he was a very quiet guy, so he didn't want to make a big fuss about it. He would return to the crease and he would collapse before the second period would start. So he ends up getting diagnosed with tuberculosis and is sent home. So December 3rd would be the last day he would go to the Canadiens locker room. He would visit them. It was a very emotional moment. He just kind of sat back in the back corner and just kind of smoked a cigar. And he had a couple moments where he was teary eyed, but he didn't want to make it about himself. He was a very quiet guy. So he would end up passing away on March 27th of 1926. So in his honor, the Canadians would donate a new award to the league, which was, of course, the Vesna Trophy. Now, the trophy originally went to the team or to the goalie whom allowed the fewest goals in the season. But now, of course, as we know, it goes to the goalie who is, quote, adjusted to be the best at this position. So, in other words, it went to the guy who allowed the fewest goals originally, but now it goes to the guy who has the best season because, you know, put it this way, it gets to a point where if you have a team that has this elite defense and only allows, 800 shots in the season, and the goalie allows 200 goals, and then you have a team where the defense is garbage and they allow, 1,600 shots, and that goalie allows 205 goals, the old Vezina Trophy would have gone to the guy who had a 750 save percentage. you know. So they realized the fault and they fixed it. So the Canadians would move to the Montreal Forum before the 26-27 season. Now, the 27-28 season saw Howie Morenz become the first player in NHL history to score 50 points in a single season. So the team would beat the Bruins in the 1929-1930 Stanley Cup. So the Canadiens would make 3 Stanley Cups in the 20s, and they won 2 of them, the 23-24 season and the 29-30 season. So now we get to the 1930s, and the Canadiens had another strong season in the 1930-31 season, as they would win the Stanley Cup over the Chicago Blackhawks in a hard-fought 3-2 series. So the team begins to suffer with the Great Depression kicking into play. Now you might be saying, wait, Great Depression was America and the Canadiens are in Canada. The Great Depression affected the whole world because when your biggest, supplier hits the depression, you're gonna hit a depression. So like they would struggle to attract a crowd. So in early October of 1934, in response to this, the Canadiens traded center Howie Morenz to the Chicago Blackhawks, and this was an attempt to cut costs. However, this upset a lot of fans, and they just said, "I'm not going to games. You just traded my best player. You traded the fan favorite." So the Canadiens were actually put up for sale in 1935 and were nearly relocated to Cleveland, Ohio. But a group of Montreal businessmen would step in and purchase the team with a pledge and a promise to keep it in Montreal. So the Canadiens would struggle immensely in the 35-36 season, finishing last in the NHL. So before the 36-37 season, the Canadiens would reacquire Howie Morenz. On January 28th of 1937, the Canadiens were playing the Blackhawks in the first period, and we have a bit of a grim moment here. So Howie Morenz ends up chasing a loose puck, and he loses his balance, crashes into the boards, and he catches his left skate in the wooden siding on the boards. So a Blackhawks defenseman was chasing after him, as defensemen do to forwards with a loose puck situation. And he ends up getting caught up, and he lands full force on Morenz's leg, and he fractures it in 4 places. So Morenz is in the hospital, and the Canadiens really start to fall apart. They were soaring beforehand, and then they just completely fall off a cliff. So Morenz gets depressed, and on March 8th, he actually passes away. Now, he had tried to get up to use the restroom, and he had collapsed and died from blood clots. So basically, he wasn't doing good, and his friend and teammate Ariel Juliet had basically said, "quote Howie loved to play hockey more than anyone ever loved anything, and when he realized that he would never play it again, he couldn't live with it. Howie died of a broken heart." End quote. So after that season, after the 37-38 season, left wing Ariel Gillette would retire. And he cited in part, the fact that his good friend Howie Morenz died in front of him. It took it did damage to him. And he was getting older anyway. So they would name former player Babe Siebert as the manager prior to the 39-40 season. But in continuing a strand of bad luck for the team, he actually drowned with family before he coached a single game for the team. He was at a lake house, and something was like his daughter was out there, or they lost a toy in the water, and he went to get it and he drowned. So the Canadiens went to 1 Stanley Cup in the 1930s, and they won it, the 30-31 season. So here we are in the 1940s. So center Elmer Locke makes his debut in the 40-41 season. And before that, they had actually hired Dick Irvin as coach. So Dick Irvin was actually a strange thing. The Maple Leafs had actually fired him, and the owner of the Maple Leafs highly recommended, that the team would hire Dick Irvin as their head coach because he wanted to see hockey stay in Canada. He wanted their rivals to stay in place rather than to relocate. And the move would pay off. So right wing Maurice Richard would make his debut in the 42-43 season. So World War II really devastated a lot of teams. And remember, World War II would start on December 7th, 1941. Not officially for like the United States, But for Canada, it had started beforehand since they were still with the British at that point. But well, I'm not getting into a history lesson here. And so basically, the Canadians didn't lose a lot of players. They kind of got a little lucky, and they had like side jobs as things that were essential to the war effort, so to speak. So they kind of skirted the law. But so in the 43-44 season, they would acquire goaltender Bill Durnan, and they cruised through the 43-44 season, losing only 5 regular season games. And they easily made it to the Stanley Cup, and they easily swept in the Stanley Cup. They swept Chicago. So Rashad had a career year in the 44-45 season, becoming the first player in NHL history to score 50 goals in 50 seasons. So the team would lose the semifinals to Toronto in the playoffs. So despite a strong regular season, they faltered in the playoffs. Life goes on if you're the Canadians. The 45-46 season, they would play Boston in a very close Stanley Cup, and they would eke out Boston, winning the franchise yet another Stanley Cup. So this was the first season in which only the original 6 teams were in the NHL at this point. Now those 6 teams were, of course, the Montreal Canadiens, the Detroit Red Wings, the Boston Bruins, Chicago Blackhawks, the New York Rangers, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. At this point, all their teams are gone. Everyone else is done. It's just these 6, and it would stay that way until the mid 60s. So they would hire GM Frank Selke in the summer of 1946. Now, they would lose the 1946-47 Stanley Cup to Toronto. Defenseman Doug Harvey would make his NHL debut in the 1947-48 season. And an interesting fact about the 47-48 season was that the Canadiens had their goaltender, Bill Durnan, serve as the captain. So opposing teams did not like the fact that the Canadiens' goaltender was the captain, and they would protest it because Durnan would leave the crease to argue calls, and opponents argued that this gave the Canadiens an extra unscheduled timeout whenever he did it. So after the season, the NHL passed the Durnan rule, which banned goalies from being captains in the NHL. That rule is still in effect to date. So the Canadiens would miss the playoffs in the 47-48 season and were knocked out in the semifinals for the 48-49 and 49-50 seasons. After the 49-50 season, goaltender Bill Durnan would retire. So in the 40s, the Canadiens went to 3 Stanley Cups, and they won 2 of them, the 43-44 season and the 45-46 season. So now we get to the 1950s, and the decade would start off well for the team. In the 50-51 season, right wing Bernie Joffrin would make his NHL debut. Also making his debut for the team was center Jean Bellevue. So he would stay in Quebec for the Quebec Major Hockey League for the most part until the 53-54 season. So he just made his debut, but he would end up going back to the Quebec League for a while. The Canadiens would lose the Stanley Cup in the 50-51 season to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And in the 51-52 season, left wing Dickie Moore would make his NHL debut. Now, they again made the Stanley Cup, but they again lost, this time to the Detroit Red Wings. So the Canadiens would make the Stanley Cup for the 3rd consecutive year in the 52-53 season, and this time they would play the Boston Bruins, and this time they would win the Cup. So here we are, and they make the Stanley Cup again in the 53-54 season, but would lose to the Detroit Red Wings. After the season, center Elmer Locke would retire. So we have an interesting story here in March of 1955. We saw L'Affaire Richard, or the Richard Riot, or the Richard Riot if you're truly an Anglophone and you don't want to speak any French whatsoever. So basically, Maurice Richard was suspended for the remainder of the season, including the playoffs, after he slashed an opponent and he punched a lineman who intervened with the little fight. So Canadiens fans saw this as excessive, and they thought that the league president was handing a heavy sentence to Richard because he was a French Canadian, and the league president was not. So the NHL president was Clarence Campbell at the time, and he actually intends a Canadian home game on March 17th 1955, and he was really he received death threats, and everyone's saying, "Don't go, don't go, don't go." These guys take their hockey very seriously. He said, "Screw it, I'm gonna go." And roughly an hour into the game, a fan would toss a tear gas bomb towards Campbell. So officials would clear the stadium, and of course, not everyone's okay with that. So they're still pissed off. So the fans would start to riot, and 70 people get arrested, and over $100,000 in property damage is reported. So Rashad takes to a radio station. He asks the fans to stop rioting, which they did because they respect him. They're rioting for him, and he says, "Look, I'm going to accept my suspension, and we're going to come back next year better than ever." So the Canadiens would end up losing the 54-55 Stanley Cup to Detroit, and following that Stanley Cup loss, the coach Dick Irvin would resign, and he had health problems at this point. He would end up passing away in May of 1957 from bone cancer. So they hire a former player named Toe Blake to be the team's coach. So the younger brother of Maurice Richard, center Henri Richard, I should say, would make his debut in the 55-56 season. So under the leadership of Toe Blake and with elite play from numerous stars, the Canadiens would actually go to five consecutive Stanley Cups in this, to close out the decade and win all five of them. The 55-56, 56-57, 57-58, 58-59, and 59-60 Stanley Cups. Now they won all of these Stanley Cups within 5 games, except for the 57-58 season, in which Boston took them to a game 6. So the Canadiens were just so dominant for the latter half of the 1950s. So we have an interesting moment here. On November 1st of 1959, their goaltender Jacques Plante was struck in the nose by a shot, which broke his nose. Now remember, back then they weren't wearing masks; they looked just like this going in goal. So he demands to wear a mask. And Coach Toe Blake did not want him to, but he said, "Fine, whatever. You're not going to take the ice if you don't wear a mask. What do I care?" And he let him wear it until Plante's nose was healed. So the Canadiens won all 18 games in which Plante wore the mask. Now, after his nose was healed, Toe Blake made him take the mask off. He thought that, the mask would make it more difficult for the goaltender to see where the puck is and everything. So the first game Plante plays without the mask, the Canadiens lose. So you have an 18-game winning streak when he's wearing the mask. You take the mask off, they lose. Of course, that was superstitious, and people were like, "Oh, he needs to wear the mask." So he ends up being all mad, and Plante ends up being all mad, and Toe Blake gives in and lets him wear the mask permanently. So Plante became the first NHL goaltender to always wear a mask. Now, after this incident, Blake and Plante's relationship really began to deteriorate. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So the Canadiens in the 1950s made all 10 Stanley Cups of the decade, and they won 6 of them. The 52-53 Stanley Cup, as well as every Stanley Cup from the 55-56 season to the 59-60 season. So now we get to the 60s. And Maurice Richard would retire in September of 1960 at the urging of friend and general manager Frank Selke, who basically encouraged him to retire because he feared that Richard would suffer a major injury. He was older at this point, so it was a realistic threat. The Canadiens did not make the Stanley Cup in the 1960-61 season, which ended their streak at an unrivaled 10 appearances, 10 consecutive appearances. So defenseman Doug Harvey was traded to the New York Rangers after the 60-61 season. After the 62-63 season, left wing Dickie Moore would retire. So after that season, tensions between Toe Blake and goaltender Jacques Plante reached an all-time high. So Blake was fed up with Plante's injuries, as Plante had a bad injury history, and he had an inconsistent work ethic and a demeanor. He had a bad attitude. So Blake stated that either he or Plante must go. He was done. He wasn't going to deal with the guy anymore. So the Canadiens chose to trade Plante to the New York Rangers in early June of 1963. So, he's gone at this point, and they didn't get much for him, and Plant ends up retiring shortly after anyway, due to the injuries and everything else. In the 63-64 season, right wing Yvan Cornier would make his debut for the team. So after losing to the Maple Leafs in the semifinals of the 63-64 season, the Canadiens underwent a few changes. So their right wing Bernie Joffrin would retire. And here's where a very interesting, rough, questionable decisions made. They forced GM Frank Selke to retire. So they basically said, if you don't retire, we're going to fire you. And this upset Maurice Richard. He cut off all ties with the franchise. He said, I'm done. I can't believe you made my friend quit. So he just says, I'm done. I'm not going to deal with these guys anymore. The only person I want to talk to is the players, especially his brother, because his brother's still on the team. So this basically just pissed him off. And to replace Selke, the Canadiens would hire Sam Pollock to become the GM. Now, Pollock had a revolutionary at the time attitude, and he believed in acquiring draft picks, as he thought that good young prospects were key to long-term success in the NHL. It's crazy nobody had thought of that before him. And so the Canadiens would end up winning the 65 Stanley Cup over Chicago and the 65-66 Stanley Cup over Detroit. So at this point, the moves they made seemed to be working. So the Canadiens would cruise to the 66-67 Stanley Cup versus Toronto, and they were considered heavy favorites over the Maple Leafs, but they would lose in 6 games. So after the 66-67 season, the NHL was expanded to 12 teams, so it doubled. So all original 6 teams were thrown in the same conference, the Eastern Conference, while the expansion teams were put in the Western Conference. This was to basically ensure that expansion teams would make the playoffs or make the Stanley Cup for the first couple seasons of the league's existence. Center Jacques Lemaire would make his debut in the 67-68 season, and the Canadiens would return to the finals in the 67-68 season and easily swept the expansion St. Louis Blues. So the following season, or after that season, Toe Blake would retire. He felt he had done enough, and he didn't want to keep coaching. So defenseman Guy Lapointe would make his debut in the 68-69 season, but it was only 1 game. He would become a full-time player a season later. 2 seasons later, actually. The Canadiens once again would meet the St. Louis Blues in the 68-69 Stanley Cup, and once again swept them, despite no longer having Toe Blake. And the Canadiens would actually miss the playoffs in the 69-70 season. Crazy fact, this was the only time they did not qualify for the playoffs from the 1948 season to the 1995 season. That is utter dominance right there. So in the 60s, the Canadiens made 5 Stanley Cups, and they won 4 of them. 64-65, 65-66, 67-68, and 68-69. So now we're in the 70s, and goaltender Ken Dryden would make his debut in the late season of the 70-71 season. The Canadiens would defeat the Blackhawks in the 70-71 Stanley Cup. Now, they would actually fire their coach after winning the Stanley Cup, and they hired Scotty Bowman to replace him. So Jean Bellevue would retire after the 70-71 season. A Sam Pollock trade actually netted the team the top pick in the 71 draft, despite the fact that they had won the Stanley Cup. And with that top selection, they picked right wing Guy Lafleur, Guy the Flower, if you want to go to English. And Lafleur immediately would join the team, and he would become a superstar, as we know. Defenseman Larry Robinson would make his NHL debut in the 72-73 season, and also making his debut that season was left wing Steve Schutt. The Canadiens would win the 72-73 Stanley Cup over the Chicago Blackhawks. Defenseman Bob Gainey would make his debut in the 73-74 season, and after the 74-75 season, center Henri Richard would retire from the team and the NHL. So the Canadians would play very well in the 75-76 season, and they capped off the season with a Stanley Cup victory over my Philadelphia Flyers. So the 76-77 Canadians are often considered to be the best team in NHL history by many. They only lost 8 games in an 80-game season. They went 60 wins, 8 losses, and 12 ties. Remember, this is before overtime. So they set NHL records for most points in the season, 132, best goal differential, plus 216. So pretty impressive. Guy Lafleur actually led the NHL in points with 136 and assists with 100 with just 80, while Steve Schutt himself actually led the league in goals with 60. So the Canadiens made the Stanley Cup and they swept the Boston Bruins. So it wasn't even close. The Canadiens would win the 77-78 Stanley Cup over the Bruins, and they would win the 78-79 Stanley Cup over the Rangers. So that was our fourth consecutive Stanley Cup. And after the 78-79 season, numerous players would start to leave the team. So goaltender Ken Dryden would retire. Center Jacques Lemaire would also retire. Right wing Yvon Cornier also retired. GM Sam Pollock would retire slash step down from his role as general manager, and Coach Scotty Bowman stepped down, and he left to coach the Buffalo Sabres. The Sabres offered him the GM role and more money, and he felt he did all he could with the Canadiens. So, despite all these losses, the Canadiens would still make the playoffs that year, but they lost in the quarterfinals. So, in the 70s, the Canadiens made 6 Stanley Cups and they won all 6. Of course, they were the 70-71 season, 72-73, 75-76, 76-77, 77-78, and 78-79 seasons. Now it gets to the 80s. And in the 1980-81 season, center Guy Carbonneau would make his debut for the team. Now, they lost in the preliminary round of the playoffs that year. And during the 81-82 season, the Canadiens would trade defenseman Guy Lapointe to the Rangers. Now, the 81-82 season ended with a semifinals loss to the rival Quebec Nordiques. Captain Bob Gainey said, quote, "We can't put on our sweaters anymore and expect to win," end quote, seeing as the Canadiens were no longer the best team in the league at this point. So the 83-84 season, they would meet the Quebec Nordiques in the playoffs once more. And these two teams were arch rivals. This was a very physical series. Now, the Nordiques and Canadiens were both from Quebec, and they fought for the attention of the French-Canadian fan base. This series saw tensions between the two clubs just reach a boiling point on April 20th, 1984, which happened to be Good Friday. So this game is dubbed the Good Friday Massacre or La Bataille du Vendredi Sant. So at the end of the second period, the two teams engaged in a bench clearing brawl, which saw Nordique star Peter Stastny get his nose busted and the Canadiens' Jean Hamel get knocked out by a sucker punch. So the head referee for the game, Bruce Hood, ended the period without assessing penalties. So basically, they said, okay, what we're going to do, everybody get off the ice, just go to the locker rooms, we're done. We'll announce the penalties later. So as the teams began to warm up for the third period, the PA announcer began to announce all of the penalties. So once players knew they were going to be tossed, they just started a second massive brawl. Because what's the point? You're already getting tossed. You might as well get revenge on the guy who beat you up. So 11 players end up getting ejected after the orders restored, and the referee Bruce Hood, he retires after the postseason, with most blaming him for the mess that occurred at the end there, and the NHL probably was going to fire him if he didn't retire. So now in the 84-85 season, goaltender Patrick Waugh would make his debut for the NHL team, and he only appeared in one game. He would make he would start playing much more later on. During the 84-85 season, left wing Steve Schutt was traded to the LA Kings. After the 84-85 season, right wing Guy Lafleur would retire from the Canadiens. In his first full season in the NHL, Patrick Waugh would help his team to the Stanley Cup with his stellar play. So the Canadiens would defeat the Calgary Flames to win the Stanley Cup that year. The next year, the Canadiens fell in the Eastern Conference Finals, And the young Canadiens again would make the playoffs in the 87-88 season, but they lost early on. So the 88-89 team would make it to the Stanley Cup yet again, but they would lose to the Calgary Flames. So after the 88-89 season, defenseman Bob Gainey retired and defenseman Larry Robinson would leave the team to join the LA Kings. So the Kings are starting to be a dynasty at this point. The Canadiens aren't the dynasty anymore that they were. The Canadiens stumbled a little in the 89-90 season, and they lost early on in the playoffs. Most of that was due to the fact that they lost two key veteran defensemen and their captain, Bob Gainey. So the Canadiens made two Stanley Cups in the 80s and won one of them being the 85-86 Stanley Cup. Now we get to the 90s. So the first two seasons in the new decade saw minimal success for the Canadiens as they would make the playoffs but lose in the divisional round. So the 92-93 season saw the Canadiens make a run to the playoffs. They went to the Stanley Cup and defeated the LA Kings. Now, this is the most recent Stanley Cup that a Canadian team has won. You can call it the curse of Bettman. You can call it the curse of the U.S. I don't know what they want to call it in Canada, but this is the most recent Stanley Cup a Canadian team has won. So the Canadiens would fall to Boston in the 93-94 quarterfinals. So after the 93-94 season, the team would trade center Guy Carbonneau to the St. Louis Blues. The Canadiens missed the playoffs in the 94-95 season, which was their last full season playing at the Montreal Forum. So on December 2nd, 1995, the Detroit Red Wings defeated the Canadiens 11-1. So Patrick Roy, who had problems with the Canadiens coach at that point, had allowed 9 goals on 26 shots. Roy was finally pulled midway through the second period, and as he got to the bench, he went to the Canadiens president, Randall Corey, and said, quote, "It's my last game in Montreal," end quote. So Roy told the media that his coach had kept him in the net to humiliate him, and he meant it. So he ends up getting suspended by the team for refusing to report. And only 4 days later, on December 6th, he gets traded to the Colorado Avalanche. Now, this trade is heavily, criticized. People said they shouldn't have made that trade. They should have calmed things out. You should have kept their franchise goaltender more than, the coach. But he had made up his mind while it was done. So on March 11th, 1996, the Canadiens would play their last home game at the Montreal Forum. The team would move to the Molson Center. So the Canadiens entered an era of mediocrity to close out the 90s. They would barely make the playoffs if they made them at all, and when they did, they never really made it far. So the Canadiens finished last in the Northeast Division in the 98-99 season, and rumors began to swirl that the team may be sold or relocated. So the team made one Stanley Cup in the 90s, and they won it, being the 92-93 season. So now we enter the 2000s, and the Canadiens played poorly as the 2000s began. In the summer of 2001, the team was put up for sale. So fans were very nervous that the franchise would relocate to the United States as the Canadian dollar was struggling, and there weren't a lot of local buyers interested in buying the team. So the Canadiens ended up getting sold in June of 01, but it was announced that the team would remain in Montreal to the joy of the fans everywhere. And the sale had a clause in it that made it so the NHL Board of Governors would have to unanimously approve any attempt to move the Canadiens to a new city. So this really calmed everybody in Montreal down. Because remember, at this point, they had recently lost the Quebec Nordiques. So before the 01-02 season, the Canadiens announced that captain, please forgive me, Saku Koivu, was suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and that he would miss the entire season. However, he would return with 3 games left in the season. So his return re-energized the team at the right time, and they made the playoffs as the 8th seed. They went on to upset the 1-seeded Boston Bruins in the first round of the playoffs, but they fell in the next round. So in September of 2002, the Molson Center is renamed to the Bell Center. And midway through the 02-03 season, the Canadiens would hire Claude Julien for the first time to be their coach. So now we get to November 22nd, 2003, in which the Canadiens would play in the first outdoor game in NHL history. They would play at Edmonton and they won. Just a little interesting fact there. The 0304 Canadiens, this time a 7 seed, would play the Bruins, this time a 2 seed in the first round of the playoffs, and again pulled the upset, but again fell in the next round. So the 0405 season gets canceled due to the lockout, as we know. And midway through the 0506 season, Claude Julien is fired. In 2007 2008 season, goaltender Carey Price would make his NHL debut, and the team would lose in the quarterfinals of the playoffs. In the 2009 2010 season, defenseman PK Subban would make his debut for the team, and the 09 2010 Canadians would make the Eastern Conference Finals as an 8 seed, but they lost to the 7 seeded Philadelphia Flyers in a really crazy NHL Eastern Conference playoff run. So the Canadians did not make any Stanley Cups in the 2000s. Now we get to the 2010s. And the 2010-11 Canadiens would make the playoffs, but they didn't make much noise. The 2011-2012 Canadiens would finish last in the East, mostly due to a number of injuries. The 2012-2013 Canadiens rebounded well, and they entered the playoffs as a 2 seed in the East. However, they would lose in the first round. So the 2013-2014 Canadiens made a run, sweeping Tampa Bay and defeating arch rival Boston in 7 games. However, in Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals, the team would lose Carey Price to an injury, and they would fall to the Rangers in 6. So by this point, it was clear that Carey Price was an elite goaltender, and he basically carries them to the playoffs in the 2014-2015 season, and he took home numerous awards for his stellar play that year. But the team didn't do well in the playoffs. One player does not make a team. So the 2015-2016 Canadiens started off red hot with a 9-game winning streak, but the injury bug struck them, and they ended up missing the playoffs. In late June of 2016, the Canadiens would trade defenseman PK Subban to the Nashville Predators in exchange for defenseman Shea Weber. So the 2016-2017 Canadiens again started off hot, but cooled off, prompting the team to bring back former coach Claude Julien. The Canadiens would fall in the first round of the playoffs yet again in the 16-17 season, and the team struggled in the 17-18 season. So the Canadiens were the best team point-wise to miss the playoffs in the 2018-2019 season. So at this point in the coronavirus break, the team was 31-31-9, and that was good enough for them to make the play-in round of the playoffs. No Stanley Cup appearances at this point in the 2010s. Of course, the 2019-2020 season is still technically ongoing. If they end up, I will be doing a video once that Stanley Cup is decided, if anyone who I've done makes it. So the Canadiens have been to 34 Stanley Cup finals, winning 24 of them, losing 9 of them, and having won, the one with the Spanish flu, ended in no decision. 65 people with ties to the Canadiens are in the Hall of Fame. Now they have 15 numbers retired, and those 15 numbers honor 18 players. Those numbers are number 1, Jacques Plante, number 2, Doug Harvey, number 3, Emile Bouchard, number 4, Jean Bellevue, number 5, which honors Bernie Joffrin and Guy Lapointe, number 7, Howie Morenz, number 9, Maurice Richard, number 10, Guy Lafleur, number 12, which honors Dickie Moore and Yvonne Cornier, number 16, which honors Henri Richard and Elmer Locke, number 18, Serge Savard, number 19, Larry Robinson, number 23, Bob Gainey, number 29, Ken Dryden, and number 33, Patrick Waugh. And that is the history of the Montreal Canadiens. A long, storied history for the team that's been around since the beginning of the NHL and actually helped found the NHL. Winning 24 Stanley Cups, that's pretty impressive. That's the record, of course, for NHL Stanley Cup wins. People call them the Yankees of the NHL. It's not fair to compare the two of them. It's a completely different sport and everything like that. But the Canadiens are a great team. After doing the research for this video, I actually have become more of a Canadiens fan. They have replaced Buffalo as my number 2 team. Of course, I have French-Canadian blood. So the fact that the team was made for French Canadians just kind of made my day. And You know, it was a lot of work doing this one just because of all the history that the team had. And you notice I didn't mention a couple of guys who I discussed in retired players like Emile Bouchard. A lot of these guys just there were so many people to write about for the Canadians, and you'll notice again with like teams like the Yankees, Red Sox, they have a lot of great players that I can't discuss every single person without making this like a 2.5 hour video, and I know that you guys wouldn't care for that. But that again was the history of the Montreal Canadiens, Les Montreal Canadiens. So I apologize if I mispronounced any names. I apologize if you didn't like my French here and there. But I hope you guys enjoyed the day. Again, join us tomorrow. We'll be doing a special video for July 1st. I hope you guys had a great month. And I hope you guys enjoy this series. If you haven't already, we do have the Boston Bruins video. It is already up. It was done about a month ago. Definitely check it out. This is video 2 of the NHL history of, and this is video 6 of the history of videos. If you haven't seen it already, I did do a trade breakdown of the Robert Griffin III trade earlier this week, and yesterday Patrick posted a recap video of the races that happened in NASCAR this past weekend. So definitely check it out, and we have a few more videos coming up this week. But have a great day, guys, and allez les Canadiens against the Pittsburgh Penguins.